Hello, welcome to this new tutorial series in which we're going to deconstruct Oberheim's OB-Xa synthesizer, an emulation by Arturia. And here it is in its full magnificent glory. 1980 this thing was released, and it was designed to be a direct competitor to the sequential circuits Prophet 5. I've done a video series on that as well, and they really are just absolutely magnificent synths, and peppered throughout the early 80s. These two synthesizers went head to head. And when you think one of these would have cost you the best part of $5,000 when it was originally released, it's kind of awesome that we just get to play with these things and almost take it for granted. And I try very hard not to. I think we're very lucky to just be able to play these amazing instruments. As usual with these video series, the first thing that I like to do is to have a look at the oscillators. It's the heart of the synthesizer, it's where the sound comes from. And so today we're going to break down the oscillator section and see what it can do. Well, it's a dual oscillator, 16-part multi-timbral synth. The original OB-Xa was 8 voices, but Arturia have expanded that to 16, and that's in the context of each voice having access to 2 oscillators. Now I've loaded up the default template sound here, which gives us the simplest sawtooth wave we've got access to. There's a single C note, and you can see in the oscilloscope our sawtooth, but you'll note that we've got some volume controls weirdly in the filter section, but these are the volume controls for the oscillator bank, and you can see that oscillator 2 is turned all the way down. While it is, let's just have a look first at oscillator 1. Here is our master frequency set to 8 foot, throwback to the old days of pipe organs. And if we drop it to 16 foot, then play the same note. It's just been dropped an octave, pretty straightforward stuff. Underneath, you've got the weird wave-shaped buttons. These are a little bit quirky. The sawtooth is selected by default, and you can see the little light on. If I turn sawtooth off, however, we're going to get a triangle wave. That's why it's kind of sat in the middle. And there's our triangle wave. And if I turn the right-hand button on, we're going to get a square wave. And there's the square wave. As an extra bonus, we can turn both sawtooth and square wave on at the same time, and we get a composite that's a bit of both. If I just take the sawtooth aspect of the wave away for a moment to allow us to talk about pulse width. So if I press a note, can you see that the upper part of the square is exactly the same length as the lower part of the square? This is called the duty cycle. And it's basically a 50-50 split. And if I change the pulse width, you're going to see one of those, the upper bar get longer and the lower bar gets shorter. And more interestingly, from a musical perspective, the tone changes. Now, when we come to study modulation a little bit later, we'll see that we can automate a lot of these things or modulate them. So we can vary that over time, and you get this kind of effect. At this point, it's time to bring oscillator number 2 in, and so I will. But I'm going to leave oscillator 1 on. And the first thing that I want to do is set both of them up to play sawtooths. I'm going to play the same C note over and over again. Can you hear each time I press the note? Sometimes it sounds slightly different. The 2 oscillators aren't perfectly synchronized, which means that how those 2 waves are generated varies very slightly each time I press the key. And this is introducing a concept called phase, where the beginning point of each wave dramatically affects how they sound. It is possible by messing around with phase to completely cancel 2 waves out and end up with no sound whatsoever. And that's not what we're getting here, but we do get very slight change of the starting position of the waves each time we play them. Now you can get rid of this very minor variance between the two waves by synchronizing them together. But when you do synchronize waves in this way, you get a very special effect. It's called hard sync, and that's what this button here does. What happens when you engage hard sync is the oscillator 2, which in this context is now called the slave, is forced to begin redrawing its wave, generating its sound again, every time oscillator 1 restarts. So each time oscillator 1 comes back to the beginning of its wave and begins, drawing its shape, oscillator 2 is forced to do so as well. The way I'm going to demonstrate this is, now that I've synced these two things together, first of all, let's hear what it sounds like. It's absolutely rock solid and consistent. We've lost all of that variance, and it looks like just a regular sawtooth. What I'm going to do now is increase the frequency of oscillator 2, and you'll notice that there's no change in pitch whatsoever. Every single note that I'm pressing is a C, exactly a C. But we do get this dramatic change of shape of the oscillator. And what we've got here is the illustration, the oscilloscope-based illustration of oscillator 2 doing its thing. Because I've increased the frequency of oscillator 2, it wants to cycle much faster than oscillator 1. But here is the point at which oscillator 1 is done, and it's finished drawing one instance of its sawtooth shape. Oscillator 2 is forced to begin redrawing its wave. And so we get kind of like 1.5 waves. Now, because oscillator 1 is the master controller, master and slave, it determines the pitch of the overall sound. So now if I change the frequency of oscillator 1, you will get a genuine change of pitch. Back to oscillator 2. This hard sync effect is a classic artifact of the late 70s and early 80s. Lots of instruments implemented this feature as it was kind of discovered, and then everybody realised how cool it sounded. And so this is the implementation on the OB-Xa. Let's take it back out of sync, and I'll just mute oscillator 1 momentarily, just to show you that oscillator 2 has exactly the same, let's bring it back down again, wave options as the original one did, oscillator 1. Turn them both off, and we're going to get our triangle. There's our triangle wave. But we actually have different methods for altering the frequency of oscillator 2. The master slider moves in semitones rather than octaves, which oscillator 1 did. And we also have a fine detune control. In addition to the two tonal oscillators, we also have a noise generator, which is white noise. So it's basically white noise is all of the frequencies played all at the same time. So there's no attenuation of any particular frequency here. And you can see it's absolutely flat across the frequency spectrum. A little bit of a tailing off right at the top and the bottom, but that's considered to be white noise, as opposed to pink noise, which has an intrinsic low-pass filter applied to it. Turn the noise back off. And the last thing for us to look at in the oscillator bank is X-mod. Now this stands for cross-modulation. Now there are two different ways I can demonstrate cross-modulation. Firstly, I'll just turn oscillator 1 on, and let's hear what happens when I turn this control. So that's a pitch variance. We have frequency modulation being applied to oscillator 1. Now that frequency modulation is coming from oscillator 2. That's why it's called cross-modulation, because one oscillator, an oscillator operating in audible frequencies, is being used to modulate oscillator 1. And that's why we hear a change of pitch. Now the manual talks about cross-modulation in terms of ring modulation effect. It can be used for that sonic purpose. It can be made to sound like ring modulation, but ring mod is actually an example of amplitude modulation. You're changing volume or amplitude. So it's a little bit confusing. You know, these terms are used almost interchangeably, and actually different synthesizer manufacturers implement cross modulation as amplitude modulation just to make it even more complicated. But this is FM, and that's why we're getting the distinct change of pitch. Now I'm going to turn oscillator 2 on so that we're hearing both oscillators simultaneously. And I'm going to reset the detune. There was a tiny amount of detune applied to the template there, just knocking these two oscillators very, very slightly out of pitch with each other. But I'm locking them together now. And so we've got this composite wave. And now when I introduce cross modulation, there's the pitch going. And with cross modulation fully applied, this is the kind of sound that you're starting to get with dedicated FM synthesizers, which was really the next evolution in synthesizers. In the early 80s, primarily the Yamaha DX7 is the most famous implementation of it, but all of these concepts, you can basically see them evolving in the history of synths. So this is an early example of what would ultimately go on to become a completely different branch of synthesis. So that's an introduction to the oscillators dealt with. In the next video, we'll have a look at the filter bank and see what it has to offer. Hope to see you then. Thanks very much for watching.